It was no different from any other night. The Mexico City sky was covered in the gray clouds of winter, and the urban silence was only interrupted by the passing of a distant car or the constant murmur of the wind through the trees. But inside a small room, in a humble house in the Iztapalapa neighborhood, a woman of prayer awoke trembling. She had had a dream. Not just any dream. She described it as a call. A soft but firm voice saying, "Mexico, wake up. Because what is coming will be stronger than the earthquake, darker than the night, and more urgent than hunger." Her name was Guadalupe, as if fate itself had prepared her to hear what thousands were ignoring. The next day, through tears, she shared her experience with a local prayer group. The strange thing was that two other women from different parts of the city claimed to have had a very similar dream that same night. Neither knew each other. Neither knew what the other had experienced. But the message was consistent. The Virgin was warning her people, and that warning wasn't symbolic or distant. It was immediate. It was Mexican. Rumors began to spread on social media through live broadcasts on small Christian and Catholic channels. Something big is going to happen, some said. They're warning us from heaven, others wrote. But while some mocked and called believers exaggerated, others began to search for deeper answers. Why now? Why Mexico? And why the Virgin Mary? In Tepic, Nayarit, a young missionary posted a video of herself crying. She said that while praying the rosary in the silence of the early morning, she felt the atmosphere change. Her room was filled with an inexplicable aroma, like fresh roses. Then a picture on her wall began to glow faintly, and a phrase struck a chord in her heart. "Prepare yourselves, for my mantle will cover those who are on their knees." And the video went viral in a matter of hours, not because of effects or editing, but because of the sincerity with which she spoke. Her face showed something that couldn't be faked. Holy fear. Something inside her knew this wasn't an ordinary emotional experience. It was a visitation. What few knew was that that same week, similar dreams, apparitions, and signs were being reported in at least 6 different cities. In Monterrey, a boy barely 9 years old woke up screaming in the middle of the night. He told his mother between sobs, "The lady told me the test is coming, but I shouldn't be afraid if I pray with my heart." The mother, initially incredulous, was surprised to see her son draw a figure with a blue cloak and a light behind him. "I saw it in the sky," the little boy said, with a certainty that chilled the skin. Priests began to be approached by faithful seeking guidance. Some urged caution. Others acknowledged that something unusual was indeed happening. But there was one priest in particular who dared to speak publicly, Father Ignacio in Puebla. During a homily broadcast online, he firmly stated, "Children, heaven is speaking, and if we don't listen, the stones will. Do not be afraid, but do not be lukewarm either. We are in defining times." This message lit a spark. What had previously been seen as something isolated began to take shape. All of Mexico seemed to be under a kind of invisible veil. Something was moving in the spiritual realm, and those who were attentive to prayer knew it. These weren't hallucinations, they weren't coincidences. It was a chain of calls, each one clearer than the last, and they all pointed in one direction. The Virgin Mary was trying to protect her children, but only those with open souls' ears could receive her warning. Some skeptics claimed it was mass hysteria, but those who lived through it knew better. There was no anxiety, no manipulation. There were tears, there was peace, there was, above all, urgency. And it was precisely this urgency that led a group of women in Guadalajara to gather together to do something that hadn't been seen in years. They began walking the streets with rosaries in their hands, praying for their neighborhoods, blessing homes, and fasting for their families. Most of them were housewives with young children and responsibilities they couldn't leave behind. But they felt they could remain silent no longer. "If this is real," they said, "we can't stand by and watch the country spiritually collapse." And while the media focused on political issues, violence, and economic figures, a silent war was raging in the hearts of millions of Mexican Christians. A war between fear and faith, between indifference and awakening, between lukewarmness and fire. Guadalupe, the woman who received the first dream, began to write down everything she felt in her heart, and one of her phrases became a motto among the believers who followed her. If Mexico has been a land of apparitions, it will also be a land of restoration. But first, purification will come. That echo kept repeating itself in meetings, broadcasts, retreats, and vigils. It seemed as if the same spirit was connecting people who had never met, but who were beginning to speak the same soul language, the language of crying out. And you, who are listening to these words, don't you feel something calling you inside? Isn't there a restlessness deep inside that makes you think this isn't just another story? Because if you've come this far, you too may be among those chosen to hear the whisper before the roar, to wake up before the day turns to night. Comment below if you too have felt this call. Write with Faith, Mexico, I hear your cry, and share this message with 3 people you know who can't fall asleep spiritually. Like it if you believe the Virgin Mary is still speaking today. And if you felt this video was for you, subscribe to the channel and activate the bell, because what we're going to reveal in the next episode won't leave you indifferent. Only a few days had passed since Guadalupe shared her dream, and everything began to spread like a silent wildfire. But something strange happened in that brief span. Dozens of people began to feel the same inexplicable urge to head to Tepeyac Hill. This wasn't an organized pilgrimage. There were no signs, no religious groups, no tour buses. It was as if the soul of Mexico had been shaken from within, taken back to its point of origin, to the place where the Virgin of Guadalupe had appeared centuries before to change the history of an entire continent. It was as if heaven itself wanted to reset something, return to its roots, restore faith to where it had once flourished with power. A young woman named Maria Fernanda, who lived in Tlalnepantla, recounted waking up to a sudden vision, the hill illuminated by an intense light descending from the sky. In the vision, thousands of people were kneeling in prayer, and from the Virgin's mantle flowed a kind of river that ran throughout Mexico. That morning, not knowing what awaited her, she dressed in white, took her rosary, and walked alone toward Tepeyac. Upon arriving, she encountered a sight that made her skin crawl. More than 30 people, also dressed in white, also carrying rosaries, also having disagreed, stood there in complete silence. No one spoke. All that could be heard was the wind and the whisper of the rosary beads moving through fingers. There were tears, there was trembling, but also a profound peace that felt like an embrace. Everyone shared an invisible certainty. The Virgin had called them there. It was on that day that people began to talk about the call of the mantle, an expression that went viral on social media among young Catholics who felt something new was being born. It wasn't a movement with a name, nor an organization. It was a spontaneous response to a call that many couldn't explain, but that burned in their hearts. And although some tried to ridicule the experience, the power of what was being experienced was deeper than any mockery. The testimonies kept coming. A man from Monterrey dreamed about Tepeyac without ever having visited it. He accurately described the chapel, the stairs, the vegetation. He even mentioned a tree that only someone who has been there would recognize. In his dream, the Virgin told him, "The heart of Mexico bleeds, but it can still heal if it returns to me." Another testimony came from a woman who worked as a doctor in Oaxaca. Despite not considering herself religious, she felt compelled to take a vacation and go to the mountains. "I don't know what happened to me," she said in an online interview, "but it was as if an invisible voice was calling my name. I felt like a child again, and being there, I understood that all my professional success was worthless if I lost my soul." But it wasn't just individuals who were being touched. Entire communities began organizing public rosaries, penitential walks and vigils. Young people, normally distant from the spiritual life, silently joined in. There was something that drew them, something they couldn't explain, but they knew was real. They called it Mary's gaze. Many claim to have felt the image of the Virgin in the basilica looking directly at them, as if reading their sins, but also offering them comfort. In the midst of this spiritual wave, an elderly priest named Fray Esteban broke the silence from the convent in Tulancingo. During a brief interview, he uttered a phrase that shook those who heard him. "We believe Tepeyac was just a memory, but the Mother has returned to the same place to prepare us, because a crossroads is coming for Mexico." A crossroads? What did that mean? In the following weeks, fragments of an ancient writing found in the archives of a forgotten convent in Morelia began to circulate. It was a manuscript by a 17th century Franciscan missionary. In it, he described a vision he had had. "I saw Tepeyac surrounded by fire, but it was not a fire of destruction, but of purification. From the heart of the hill, tears flowed, and the lady, clothed in the sun, spread her mantle over the land, while voices cried from heaven, 'Return before it is too late.'" No one had paid attention to that text until now. The connection between current events and that manuscript was impossible to ignore. And many began to suspect that the Virgin was repeating a warning that, for centuries, had been ignored or kept silent. A warning that spoke of imminent sorrow, but also of a unique opportunity for the conversion of the entire country. It was then that something else happened. On a cold dawn, right at the foot of Tepeyac, a group of women saw a blue light momentarily envelop the image of the Virgin in the closed basilica. There were no spotlights, no cameras, only the testimony of those souls who fell to their knees, understanding that the call had intensified. It wasn't just a whisper, it was a cry of love, a final invitation before what was to come. And among those present, someone uttered a phrase that resonated on social media for weeks. "If we don't respond now, it will be too late. The hill has spoken, and this time we can't ignore it." This phenomenon raised profound questions in many hearts. What does Mary want to tell us from this mountain? What should we do as Mexican Christians? Have we strayed so far from God that all we have left is correction? Or do we still have time to return, on our knees with rosary in hand and repentant souls? Because if it's true that Mexico was a chosen land, it's also true that the enemy has tried to strip it of that title. But the Virgin has come again to the place where it all began. Not to remember the past, but to activate the present and to prepare her people for what is about to happen. Are you willing to answer this call? If you, too, have felt that desire to return to your origins, to walk in silence toward the place where faith awakened, write in the comments, "Mother, here I am. Speak to me from Tepeyac." Do. And if you felt this message touched your soul, don't leave without leaving your like and sharing it with 3 people who also need to return to the mountain of calling. Subscribe to the channel now and turn on notifications, because the next video will reveal the secret silenced for centuries, and it could change the way you see Mexico's spiritual history. Only a few days had passed since Guadalupe shared her dream, and everything began to spread like a silent wildfire. But something strange happened in that brief span of time. Dozens of people began to feel the same inexplicable urge to head to Tepeyac Hill. This wasn't an organized pilgrimage. There were no signs, no religious groups, no tour buses. It was as if the soul of Mexico had been shaken from within, taken back to its point of origin, to the place where the Virgin of Guadalupe had appeared centuries before to change the history of an entire continent. It was as if heaven itself wanted to reset something, return to its roots, restore faith to where it had once flourished with power. A young woman named Maria Fernanda, who lived in Tlalnepantla, recounted waking up to a sudden vision, the hill illuminated by an intense light descending from the sky. In the vision, thousands of people were kneeling in prayer, and from the Virgin's mantle flowed a kind of river that ran throughout Mexico. That morning, not knowing what awaited her, she dressed in white, took her rosary, and walked alone toward Tepeyac. Upon arriving, she encountered a sight that made her skin crawl. More than 30 people, also dressed in white, also carrying rosaries, also having disagreed, stood there in complete silence. No one spoke. All that could be heard was the wind and the whisper of the rosary beads moving through fingers. There were tears, there was trembling, but also a profound peace that felt like an embrace. Everyone shared an invisible certainty. The Virgin had called them there. It was on that day that people began to talk about the call of the mantle, an expression that went viral on social media among young Catholics who felt something new was being born. It wasn't a movement with a name nor an organization. It was a spontaneous response to a call that many couldn't explain, but that burned in their hearts. And although some tried to ridicule the experience, the power of what was being experienced was deeper than any mockery. The testimonies kept coming. A man from Monterrey dreamed about Tepeyac without ever having visited it. He accurately described the chapel, the stairs, the vegetation. He even mentioned a tree that only someone who has been there would recognize. In his dream, the Virgin told him, "The heart of Mexico bleeds, but it can still heal if it returns to me." Another testimony came from a woman who worked as a doctor in Oaxaca. Despite not considering herself religious, she felt compelled to take a vacation and go to the mountains. "I don't know what happened to me," she said in an online interview, "but it was as if an invisible voice was calling my name. I felt like a child again. And being there, I understood that all my professional success was worthless if I lost my soul." But it wasn't just individuals who were being touched. Entire communities began organizing public rosaries, penitential walks, and vigils. Young people, normally distant from the spiritual life, silently joined in. There was something that drew them, something they couldn't explain, but they knew was real. They called it Mary's gaze. Many claimed to have felt the image of the Virgin in the basilica looking directly at them, as if reading their sins, but also offering them comfort. In the midst of this spiritual wave, an elderly priest named Fray Esteban broke the silence from the convent in Tulancingo. During a brief interview, he uttered a phrase that shook those who heard him. "We believed Tepeyac was just a memory, but the Mother has returned to the same place to prepare us, because a crossroads is coming for Mexico." A crossroads? What did that mean? In the following weeks, fragments of an ancient writing found in the archives of a forgotten convent in Morelia began to circulate. It was a manuscript by a 17th century Franciscan missionary. In it, he described a vision he had had. "I saw Tepeyac surrounded by fire, but it was not a fire of destruction, but of purification. From the heart of the hill, tears flowed, and the lady clothed in the sun spread her mantle over the land, while voices cried from heaven, 'Return before it is too late.'" No one had paid attention to that text until now. The connection between current events and that manuscript was impossible to ignore, and many began to suspect that the Virgin was repeating a warning that, for centuries, had been ignored or kept silent. A warning that spoke of imminent sorrow, but also of a unique opportunity for the conversion of the entire country. It was then that something else happened. On a cold dawn, right at the foot of Tepeyac, a group of women saw a blue light momentarily envelop the image of the Virgin in the closed basilica. There were no spotlights, no cameras, only the testimony of those souls who fell to their knees, understanding that the call had intensified. It wasn't just a whisper, it was a cry of love, a final invitation before what was to come. And among those present, someone uttered a phrase that resonated on social media for weeks. "If we don't respond now, it will be too late. The hill has spoken, and this time we can't ignore it." This phenomenon raised profound questions in many hearts. What does Mary want to tell us from this mountain? What should we do as Mexican Christians? Have we strayed so far from God that all we have left is correction? Or do we still have time to return, on our knees with rosary in hand and repentant souls? Because if it's true that Mexico was a chosen land, it's also true that the enemy has tried to strip it of that title. But the Virgin has come again to the place where it all began, not to remember the past, but to activate the present and to prepare her people for what is about to happen. Are you willing to answer this call? If you, too, have felt that desire to return to your origins, to walk in silence toward the place where faith awakened, write in the comments, "Mother, here I am. Speak to me from Tepeyac." And if you felt this message touched your soul, don't leave without leaving your like and sharing it with 3 people who also need to return to the mountain of calling. Subscribe to the channel now and turn on notifications, because the next video will reveal a secret that has been silenced for centuries, and it could change the way you view Mexico's spiritual history. What until then seemed like just a series of spiritual coincidences began to turn into something much more serious. While thousands flocked to Tepeyac, feeling the call, in an ancient abbey in the state of Michoacán, a librarian monk found a forgotten manuscript. It wasn't registered in the official index. It was a worn notebook, unsigned, with handwritten letters that trembled with urgency. The title was almost erased, but a careful rub of the cover with a dry cloth revealed a chilling phrase: "Warning from the Lady of the Mantle for the days of trial." The monk, whose name was Fray Santiago, didn't know what he was holding. The first thing that caught his attention was a phrase underlined in red at the beginning of the manuscript: "Keep this message for when the fire of faith cools and the earth trembles in the hearts of my people." The text, about 30 pages long, spoke of a future time in which Mexico, the country of the mantle, would be tested spiritually and physically. It spoke of an interior exodus, of Christians who would be persecuted not with weapons, but with silence, contempt, and laws, a purification that would set the roots of faith in the nation ablaze. The most striking thing was the precision with which it described the signs of the times: the abandonment of prayer, profanations, media idolatry, attacks on marriage, mocking laughter at those who still believe in miracles. And in the midst of all this, a figure, the mother with a dark face, surrounded by light, calling from a mountain. The document recounted in exact detail what was happening at that very moment on Tepeyac. Brother Santiago, his hands still trembling, decided to scan the manuscript and send it to a trusted theologian, Father Rodrigo, a retired professor of ecclesiastical history. After reading it, the priest had no doubts. The text was authentic. It had been written in the 18th century by a Franciscan priest who claimed to have received revelations in deep prayer, but he never published it. He feared it would be misinterpreted. And he wrote at the end, "This message is not for my days, but for those in which the soul of Mexico is about to fade." The document went viral in spiritual circles. Some called it the Lost Prophecy, others Mary's Hidden Letter. The truth is that every sentence seemed more relevant than any news story. And within the text was a direct appeal: the Christians of this land should not fear, they will be shaken, but those who remain on their knees will see the glory of the mantle unfold over their families. That phrase began to circulate like wildfire among prayer communities. In WhatsApp groups, on live broadcasts at rural masses and urban vigils, the feeling that something invisible was guiding events became impossible to ignore. Meanwhile, international media began to wonder what was happening in Mexico. Why were so many young people gathering in the streets to pray? Why were hundreds of families holding processions without being summoned by the official church? Why were spontaneous healings, family reconciliations, and conversions beginning to be reported in places where indifference had previously reigned? In Guadalajara, a group of women organized a 72-hour prayer session in complete silence. Early in the morning of the second day, a young woman shared that, while meditating on the mystery of the Rosary, she heard an inner voice saying, "Mexico will be light, but first it must be tested by fire, not the fire of punishment, but the fire of truth." That word, truth, was repeated like a national echo, because the silenced manuscript spoke of precisely that, of the hour when the truth would no longer be welcome in the streets or in the homes, when the name of Jesus would be spoken in a low voice so as not to disturb others, when altars would be abandoned and the illuminated screens would become the new temples of the ego. But the prophecy didn't end in darkness. It also announced that in the midst of the spiritual desert, springs of faith would spring up, that a small remnant of Mexicans, faithful, simple, and persecuted, would once again bring the Marian message to the world, that from pain would come renewal, and that those who wept with Mary would laugh with her when the light won. Brother Santiago, seeing the impact of the message, humbly asked that it not be attributed to him. He said firmly, "I only unearthed what others hid out of fear, but this is no longer a time for silence. It is a time of fire, and the spiritual fire couldn't be extinguished." Cities began to feel it. In Leon, children prayed the rosary in schoolyards. In Chiapas, indigenous communities recounted hearing heavenly songs at dawn. In Baja California, a man who had been an atheist for years knelt in the street saying, "I felt someone calling my name, and I saw a woman dressed in light weeping for us." Everything pointed to the same thing. The Virgin hadn't remained silent. We were just too distracted to hear her. But now, with the manuscript revealed, the story had changed. At the end of the text, a strong warning shook the heart. When this message is opened, and the children of Tepeyac return to the mountain, they will know that the time of the crucible is approaching. Do not fear, for the Queen of Heaven has already set her foot upon the serpent that prowls this land. Isn't that what's happening right now? If you have felt that this word is igniting something inside you, say with faith, "Lady of the Mantle, I want to be part of the fire that never goes out." And if you believe this prophecy was meant to be heard by you today, leave your like and share it with 3 people who need to wake up. Subscribe to the channel now and hit the bell, because in the next video, we'll get into the most intense part, Christians under trial and the beginning of the spiritual fire in the streets of Mexico. Don't miss it. It wasn't long after the revelation of the manuscript that the first tremors began to be felt. Not geological, but spiritual. The atmosphere in many Mexican cities changed almost imperceptibly at first, like when a breeze heralds the arrival of a storm. The first indication was the awkward silence. People of faith, especially practicing Christians, began to notice how their words were met with judgmental looks. Praying aloud in public places was no longer respected, but rather a source of ridicule. Phrases like, "That's in the past," "Don't impose your religion," "Faith has no place in modern life," were heard. And although there were no chains, no prisons, no physical threats, the soul began to feel a more dangerous prison, that of intimidation and contempt. The fear of rejection silenced many. In offices, schools, and markets, believers chose to remain silent. Religious symbols were hidden, and many began to wonder if what the prophecy foretold was true, that a time would come when confessing Christ would be seen as a retrograde, almost offensive act. But it was precisely in this climate of coldness and shame that the fire of the Spirit began to burst forth unexpectedly. In Monterrey, a 12-year-old girl named Estrella stood up in her classroom and began to pray the Lord's Prayer. When one of her classmates fainted from a nervous breakdown, the teacher tried to stop her, but she continued, tears in her eyes. The boy woke up minutes later, and all he managed to say was, "I heard you praying for me, and I felt someone lift me up." That small leap of faith went viral, not because it was spectacular, but because it was genuine. The video of the moment was shared by thousands of people who felt that in the middle of the ice, a spark had ignited something. What no one expected was what would happen days later. A group of young people, inspired by Estrella, organized what they called the Rosary March. No announcements, no official permits, no sponsors. They simply walked through the streets of the city center with rosaries in their hands, singing and praying out loud. At first, there were 20, then 100. By nightfall, there were more than 1,000. And in the midst of the crowd, people began to appear kneeling on the sidewalks, weeping, asking for prayer, surrendering their lives to God in the middle of the street. The police didn't intervene. Some officers, on the contrary, removed their hats in a sign of respect. One of them, visibly moved, was recorded saying, "I had also distanced myself, but seeing this made me remember what I felt when I made my first communion." The fire spread as if blown upon by someone. In Veracruz, a group of fishermen interrupted their work to pray the rosary at dawn from their boats. In Zacatecas, merchants closed their stalls an hour early to gather for prayer in the main square. In San Luis Potosí, young men who had been part of gangs handed over their weapons and publicly dedicated themselves to Mary. Social media began to fill with images of Christians praying in the streets, with messages like, "We will no longer hide," or "Our faith will not be silenced." And as expected, criticism was quick to follow. Some accused them of fanaticism, others of destabilizing social peace. There were attempts at censorship, reports of blocked accounts, and even threats from certain radical groups who viewed this awakening as an offense. But far from stopping, the movement grew. Because it wasn't organized by human structures, it had no visible leaders. It was a fire without a master, a direct response to the call that the Virgin had planted in thousands of hearts. Amid this spiritual wave, deeper signs also began to emerge. A woman with terminal cancer in Hidalgo claimed to have been healed after receiving prayer in the street. A man struggling with addiction broke down in tears during one of the marches and confessed that he felt something was cleansing him inside. An elderly woman who hadn't walked for months stood up to join the prayer procession in Aguascalientes, and her story moved the entire neighborhood. But the greatest miracle was invisible: the return of courage. The Christian people, accustomed to praying in private, began to understand that faith should also be felt in the square, on the sidewalk, and on public transportation. That faith was not a secret, but a banner. And while the media was divided between ignoring or ridiculing the movement, souls continued to respond. Because when heaven acts, no human force can stop it. A phrase became a standard among the faithful: "If they want to extinguish our faith, let them prepare to see it burn." And it was true. The more they tried to silence them, the louder the chants, the prayers, the testimonies became. Some began to say that Mexico was experiencing its own Pentecost. And although no visible tongues of fire descended, what was burning were the hearts of those who for years had been spiritually asleep. It was as if the Virgin had lit a match on dry land, and now the fire could not be contained. And you, are you lighting your lamp, or are you still waiting for others to hold it for you? He says with faith, "Even if it costs me, I will not deny Christ in my land." And if you feel like something burned inside you while listening to this message, give it a like and share it with 3 people who are afraid to share their faith. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications, because in the next video, I'll tell you about a person who began to cry in the midst of pain. And what happened next transformed an entire community. It was a cloudy morning in the small town of Valle de Bravo. The air smelled of damp earth, and the bells of the parish church rang with their usual rhythm, as if unaware that something unusual was about to begin. Mrs. Teresa, in charge of cleaning the chapel in the San Gabriel neighborhood, arrived as she did every day with her broom in one hand and her rosary hanging around her neck. When she opened the door, she felt an unusual chill in the air. She thought it was the breeze, but when she looked toward the side altar where an image of the Virgin of Guadalupe rested, she stopped dead in her tracks. The image's eyes shone. At first, she thought it was the light reflecting off the glass, but as she drew closer, her heart began to beat faster. On the Virgin's cheeks, 2 drops slowly formed, as clear as real tears. They dripped with a slowness that made it impossible for them to be part of the painting. Teresa cried out, not from fear, but from something she couldn't describe. It was as if something sacred had descended at that moment. The local parish priest, Father Raphael, was immediately summoned. Upon arrival, he ordered the doors to be closed and stood alone before the image. He knelt, he wept, and then, with a broken voice, he called 3 witnesses to verify what his eyes were seeing. "The image is crying," he said, "but its face shows no sadness. It is compassion, it is pain, but it is also hope." That same day, without expecting it, the phenomenon spread. A young man passing by the church heard the rumor and recorded a short video from the entrance. The image wasn't visible up close, but Teresa's voice could be heard repeating, "The Virgin cries for us, for what we have done." The video went viral within hours. Thousands began arriving at the site. Some just to watch, others to mock. But the majority, moved by a force they didn't fully understand, went with heavy hearts, as if they needed that same Virgin to cry for them as well. What no one knew was that the image had been in the same place for more than 50 years. It had never been famous. It had no golden crowns or expensive ornaments. It was a simple image, its colors somewhat faded by time. But now, everything was changing. Because those eyes, motionless for decades, seemed to look directly into the souls of those who approached. A local journalist covered the news with skepticism. "A crying image, another story for gullible people," he said on air in his first report. But upon entering the chapel and standing for a few minutes before the Virgin, he fell to his knees. He later publicly confessed, "I didn't believe. I was mocking her. But when I saw her, I knew she was crying for me, for my arrogance, for my indifference, for my empty soul." The testimonies began to multiply. People who hadn't set foot in a church since childhood returned. Men hardened by work and the violence of life fell to their knees with the rosary between their fingers. Wounded women found solace before that image that seemed to absorb all the pain of the people, and most strikingly, the tears never ceased. For more than a week, the image wept every day at the same time, right at the beginning of the hour of mercy. The tears left no stains or damage to the painting. They were transparent, pure, with a texture that some witnesses described as water from heaven. Samples were sent for analysis. Scientists could find no explanation. Meanwhile, the name of the Virgin of Valle de Bravo began to resonate throughout the country. Many thought it was merely a local phenomenon, but what was happening there had a direct connection to the prophecies that were awakening in different parts of Mexico. Because Mary's tears weren't just a sign of pain, they were a warning. During one of the prayer sessions before the image, a girl of barely 7 years old, unaware of what was happening, said aloud, "The Mother of Heaven is sad because so many people are fighting and not praying. But she told me that if we sing, her heart will be happy." The phrase was so moving that the faithful began to sing Marian hymns amidst the collective tears. That moment was captured on video and spread around the world, not for the spectacle, but for the living faith that burned like fire among wounded hearts. It was no longer a matter of religion. It was a matter of humanity, of listening to the pain of a mother who is still waiting for her children to return. But the worst happened on the 8th day. Just as the community began a Marian vigil, a flash of lightning crossed the clear sky, followed by a brief tremor. The image stopped crying. Instead, a faint glow appeared on her mantle. Many claimed to have seen a cross-shaped glow on her chest, No one was able to capture the moment on camera, but those who saw it carried it marked in their souls. Since then, the tears have not returned, but the town is no longer the same. Families pray together, children forgave their parents, neighbors reconciled, all for an image that, without moving, spoke louder than 1,000 sermons. And just as the hidden words of the ancient manuscript had foretold, the Virgin began to express her pain, not as punishment, but as a mother who does not want to lose her children. Now the question falls upon you like a whisper from heaven. How much longer can she weep before you decide to return? If you felt these tears were also for you, please write in the comments, "Mother, I am here. Don't ignore my tears." And if this story touched your heart, don't leave without liking it, sharing it with 3 people who are going through moments of heartbreak, and subscribing to the channel. Because in the next video, you'll learn how young people are rising from the dust to form Mexico's new army of prayer. And what they're doing hasn't been seen in generations. While thousands of eyes contemplated the tears of the Virgin in Valle de Bravo on the streets of Tijuana, something even more unexpected began to take shape. Not in the churches, not on the altars, but in the alleys, on the abandoned sports fields, in the courtyards of public schools, where the name of God is barely whispered. There, where faith seemed to have been exiled, the seeds of a silent spiritual revolution began to sprout, led by the last people anyone would imagine, young people. For years, it was said that Mexican youth had drifted away from the faith, that they preferred screens to the sacraments, that they were lost in passing ideologies, that they were a rootless generation. But what no one expected was that precisely from that dust, a new army would emerge. One without weapons, without shields, without hatred, armed only with rosaries, tears, and a conviction that burned brighter than criticism. It all began with a 17-year-old boy named Mateo. He lived in a high-violence area, surrounded by gangs and drug trafficking. His father had disappeared, and his mother worked day and night to feed his 3 siblings. Mateo carried anger, frustration, and the feeling that the world was against him. Until one night, while walking along the train tracks, he saw a crucifix lying on the ground. He didn't know why, but he picked it up and put it in his pocket. That night, he dreamed of a woman dressed in light who looked at him tenderly. "You weren't born to hate," she told him. "You were born to lift up those who fall." Mateo woke up crying. He didn't know how to explain it, but something ignited inside him. He began reading the Gospels on his cell phone. Then he dared to pray in secret. Finally, with the little money he had, he bought a handful of inexpensive rosaries and began distributing them to his friends. Most laughed, but 2 accepted the gift. A week later, 5 were gathering in an abandoned field to pray. Within a month, there were more than 20. And within 3 months, more than 200 young people from at-risk areas were praying in a chain around their neighborhoods. They called it the invisible wall, because it wasn't a wall that separated them. It was a spiritual wall that protected them. The story was replicated in Puebla, Oaxaca, León, and Ciudad Juárez. Groups of young people gathered together without formal structures. They didn't ask permission. They didn't seek cameras. They didn't want fame. They just wanted to pray. They knew the world wouldn't take them seriously, but that didn't stop them. They communicated using codes like F12, Faith at 12, or MP, Mantle in the Plaza, to organize vigils, spontaneous processions, and prayer chains. Some began carrying small images of the Virgin Mary in their backpacks. Others painted phrases like, "Mary walks with us," on the walls of the most neglected neighborhoods. In the video that went viral, a tattooed young man wearing a cap and a hoarse voice declared on camera, "I was a street kid, but Mary adopted me. Now I'm a soldier in her army, and I'm not afraid." The most striking thing is that these young people weren't your typical spiritual leaders. Many came from broken homes. Some had endured extremely difficult experiences. domestic violence, abandonment, abuse. But it was precisely this wound that made them stronger. Because they didn't speak from theory. They spoke from the depths of their depths, and now they were living witnesses that prayer can lift up even those who have been buried alive. Priests began to call them the Davids of the 21st century. Because like the young shepherd in the Bible, they faced giants with a stone of faith and a slingshot of hope. Instead of weapons, they carried Bibles. Instead of insults, they carried songs. Instead of rebellion without a cause, they carried a mission to ignite Mexico with the flame of intercession. And that flame soon spread. In Guadalajara, young people set up a makeshift altar at a bus station and began praying the rosary for hours. The police tried to remove them, but an elderly woman knelt beside them. Then a father and his daughter joined them. By the end, more than 100 people were praying together as the buses continued on their way. In Cancun, a group of surfers began praying by the sea every dawn. They called it the Waves of the Mantle. In Veracruz, a street choir of teenagers sang praises in front of the cathedral, offering hugs and prayers to passers-by. Some wept without understanding why. Others returned days later, seeking more. The fire was real. It couldn't be measured with polls or statistics, but it was visible, it was palpable, and most surprisingly, it wasn't guided by adults. It was young people who carried the torch, as if heaven had chosen them to lead a new era, to remind Mexico that faith is not a thing of the past, but of the most urgent present. Faced with all this, many began to wonder, was this also written in the prophecy? The answer came again from the ancient manuscript, which read, "When you see children teaching the wise and young men kneeling in the marketplaces, you will know that the hour of the final battle has begun." Not with swords, but with burning hearts. And that battle had already begun. Today, when you walk down the street and see a young man with a rosary, don't underestimate him. Perhaps he's one of the chosen ones. Perhaps he's one of those silent warriors who are changing the destiny of an entire nation. And you? Have you joined the invisible army rising in the streets? He says with faith, "I am part of the army that prays for Mexico." And if you felt this message stirred your heart, give it a like, share it with 3 people who need to believe in young people again, and subscribe to the channel. Because in the next video, you'll learn how this fire spread, turning entire cities into living sanctuaries, places where even non-believers began to kneel. No one could have foreseen it, not even the most faithful believers who prayed day and night for a national transformation. What began as a whisper in the souls of some gradually became a collective clamor that rose like incense to every corner of Mexico. The fire that burned in the hearts of praying young people became contagious. And without anyone planning it, without campaigns, without microphones, without permission from authorities or institutions, the streets began to fill with something that hadn't been seen for decades. Knees bent on the concrete, faces raised to heaven, hands clasped in supplication. The first scene that captured national attention occurred in the city of Querétaro. In the heart of the historic center, a group of students stopped in front of the government palace, knelt, and began to pray the rosary out loud. Less than 15 minutes later, several curious onlookers joined them, then entire families. And as evening fell, more than 2,000 people filled the plaza. There were no shouts, there were no banners, only a reverent silence interrupted by the murmur of Hail Marys. Some were crying, others were singing, but everyone knew something was happening. That same day, without any direct connection, the same thing happened in Mérida, Yucatan. People who had never gathered to pray began arriving at the center as if driven by an invisible force. "I felt I had to leave home with my rosary," said a 72-year-old woman. "And when I got here, I knew I wasn't alone." When the media tried to find an explanation, they found no human logic. But those who were there knew the truth. The Virgin had lit the flame, and now it spread like an unstoppable fire. In Guadalajara, the images were even more striking. Thousands of people surrounded the Minerva roundabout and transformed that public space into a makeshift altar. Candles, flowers, Marian images and crucifixes were placed there. People of all ages sang, "Blessed be your purity," in unison, while the headlights of cars stopped in silence. No one honked, no one complained, because even the most indifferent could sense that there was something sacred there, something that went beyond the human. And in the midst of this awakening, miracles began to happen. A paralyzed man attending the Veracruz vigil in a wheelchair stood up in front of everyone after a child, unknown to him, approached to lay hands on him. The silence was complete. Then came collective tears. The man, between sobs, repeated a single phrase, "She is here." In another city, a woman suffering from severe depression confessed that she had left home intending to take her own life. But when she saw the crowd praying in the middle of the street, she felt something inside her break. She walked toward them, fell to her knees and cried out, "I can't take it anymore. Help me." The people around her hugged her, surrounded her in prayer, and that night she returned home, at peace for the first time in years. These weren't isolated events. It was an organic, living movement, nourished by heaven and sustained by willing hearts. It was as if the Spirit of God himself had decided to pass through the cities, from north to south, calling his children one by one. Even the authorities began to express concern. In Morelia, traffic officers halted the flow of traffic to allow prayer groups to continue uninterrupted. One police officer said in an interview, "I've never seen anything like this. These aren't protests. These aren't marches. It's as if God is walking with them." On social media, the hashtag #NowMexicoKneels became a trend, not because it's trendy, but because it bears witness. Each post was accompanied by an image, people praying in train stations, markets, bus terminals, hospitals. The tears were constant. So were the reconciliations, parents who hadn't spoken to their children, siblings estranged for years, couples in crisis. Everyone found a point of unity in that simple but powerful act, bending their knees. And meanwhile, the signs from heaven continued to appear. A priest in Tlaxcala shared that, during a street prayer, an intense light descended upon the wooden cross they were carrying. No one knew where it came from. There were no spotlights. There was no full moon. But everyone present saw it. Some fell to their knees, others hugged each other. No one spoke. They just prayed. But the most shocking thing was yet to be revealed. A boy of barely 6 years old, in the middle of a procession in the city of Durango, approached a microphone without being called. Dressed in simple clothing and with a rosary hanging from his neck, he said in a clear voice, "The Virgin is happy because we are returning." But there are still many who are afraid. She says that if we kneel, Mexico will not fall. His mother wept behind him. No one had taught him that phrase. No one knew how he had learned it. But everyone sensed that his voice was more than a child's. It was the echo of an ancient promise, one that now ignited in the hearts of an entire nation. Because it wasn't just about faith. It was about identity, about remembering who we are, about returning to the point where history intersected with eternity, and a woman, clothed in the sun, set foot on Mexican soil to tell us we were not alone. Today, that same woman continues to pass among us. She doesn't need gilded temples or cameras, only willing hearts, only streets where she's allowed to cry, look, speak, and above all, reign. Will you join too? Write in the comments, "Mexico kneels," and so do I. And if you felt this message touched you, leave a like, share it with 3 people who need to get back on their knees, and subscribe to the channel. Because in the next video, we'll delve into the most anticipated revelation, what many theologians already consider the fulfillment of the ancient prophecy, and what that could mean for the Mexican faith and the entire world. For generations, prophecies had been relegated to the corner of the symbolic, interpreted as distant metaphors, as warnings that would never come. But now, with every street turned into an altar, with every young person kneeling in the dust, with every tear that flowed from once forgotten images, a certainty began to penetrate hearts. What the Virgin had foretold was beginning to be fulfilled. Not with a roar, not with fire from heaven or visible punishments, but with a silent shaking that came from within. Mexico was entering the crucible, and it wasn't a condemnation, it was an opportunity. Since the revelation of the ancient manuscript, many theologians and priests began to study the phrases that had previously seemed exaggerated. One of them in particular was forcefully repeated, "And the time will come when faith will be sifted like wheat. Only that which has been forged in the flame of truth will remain standing." At first, few understood what it referred to, but as the days passed, the meaning became clearer. The first attacks began, not with direct violence, but with mockery, defamation, and media scorn. Several leaders of the prayer movement were branded on social media as fanatics, manipulators, or enemies of progress. Some lost their jobs, others were ridiculed by their own friends, and most painfully in many parishes, fearful priests decided to stop the spontaneous vigils as a precaution. The fire, which until then had ignited hearts without resistance, was now tested. The crucible was beginning to burn. But, like every true test, what seemed to weaken actually purified. In Morelos, an entire community was evicted from a property where they held daily prayers. The police arrived with a warrant in hand, but instead of protesting, the faithful knelt in the neighboring grass and began to pray the rosary aloud. The image was so powerful that a reporter covering the event dropped her microphone mid-broadcast and joined in the prayer. In Monterrey, a teenager was beaten by other students after refusing to remove the crucifix hanging from her backpack. They told her she was offending the new school order. But instead of remaining silent, the young woman recorded a video reading Psalm 91 and posted it on social media. Within hours, more than 500,000 people shared her courage. The crucible was doing its work, the lukewarmness was melting, the masks were falling away. Faith was beginning to shine not only in the temples, but in the midst of pain, in the midst of rejection. As if heaven itself wanted to ensure that only those who truly love remained standing. And just then, a new signal shook the country. At the shrine of Our Lady of Zapopan, during a regular mass, an elderly nun received a vision while praying in silence. Beside her, the image of the Virgin seemed to slightly incline its face. No one else saw it, but what the nun said next shocked everyone present. The Virgin says, "This is the time of the crucible, but it is also the time of renewal. Only those who pass through the flame can carry the light." The phrase was handwritten by one of the faithful and placed at the foot of the image. Since then, hundreds of people began arriving at the sanctuary with the same request: "Teach me not to fear the crucible." Because it wasn't about seeking comfort. It was about embracing the trial, understanding that faith doesn't mature in comfort, but in battle. And Mexico was being tested not because it had been forgotten by God, but because it had been chosen. An elderly priest from Chiapas summed it up in a simple homily: "When God wants to do something great, he first shakes off all that is false. And when there is no more pretense, then the true light appears. Mexico is being shaken, because what is coming is glory. And that glory, according to the prophecies, will not be visible in palaces or domes, but in homes, in the streets, in children who pray with faith, in parents who reconcile, in families who kneel together before a simple image and say, 'Here we are, Mary, cleanse us.' The fire is not over, the trials continue, but with each passing day, more souls decide not to back down. More knees bend, more hearts open, because the crucible, though painful, also liberates. And what will emerge from it will not only be a stronger people, it will be a redeemed Mexico, prepared for the prophetic role that the Virgin has assigned to it for centuries. And you, who have listened to this message up to this point, are you willing to go through the crucible, to let the fire transform you even if it hurts? Write in the comments, I will not fear the crucible, because Mary walks with me. And if you felt these words were for you, leave a like, share with 3 people who are also going through this trial, and subscribe to the channel. Because in the next video, we'll reveal the final call Mary is making to Mexico, a prophetic choice that will mark the course of the entire continent. Get ready. In the midst of purification, when the fire of the crucible began to reveal sincere hearts and separate the false from the true, a new wave of messages began to emerge. It didn't come from isolated dreams or solitary visions. It was like a single echo, resounding in different regions of the country at the same time. From Baja California to Yucatan, from Chiapas to Chihuahua, the same phrase emerged from different lips, different ages, different languages, and different cultures. Mexico, I have chosen you for the dawn of a new era. The phrase was always the same. It didn't change. It didn't adapt. It was like a sealed line from heaven. And it wasn't spoken in a triumphant tone, but with a charge of tenderness and gravity that paralyzed the soul. The message wasn't flattery. It was a responsibility, a choice that came not from merit, but from mercy, a calling that couldn't be ignored. It all began with an elderly farmer in Aguascalientes. During a simple Marian vigil, while the rosary was being prayed under a tree, the man suddenly stood up and said in a firm voice, "The Virgin has spoken to me. She said this country has been marked, that it will be a light when other nations are darkened, but we still have time to decide." No one had asked him to speak. He'd never had visions before, but his face displayed an unshakable serenity, as if he'd just seen something the others couldn't yet understand. 2 days later, in a cloistered convent in Tlaxcala, a nun wrote a phrase in her diary that moved her. "Mexico, you have been marked by the fire of the Spirit to open the doors of restoration." Her superior, upon reading it, immediately connected it with the peasant's words. And so more and more testimonies began to emerge. A boy in Guerrero woke up crying, saying, "The Virgin told me not to be afraid because Mexico is moving forward." A young woman in Sonora felt her heart burning in prayer, and an inner voice repeating endlessly, "The new time will be born from you." A priest in Durango, without having heard of any of these cases, spontaneously preached about the country's prophetic mission and concluded his homily with the same phrase, "I have chosen you for the dawn of the new time." The most attentive understood that it was no coincidence. It was direction. It was a divine, meticulous movement, destined to ignite a generation being formed amidst the ashes. It wasn't a political or social choice. It was a spiritual choice. Mexico wasn't being called to lead the world with human strength, but with the power of intercession, of witness, of silent sacrifice. In Puebla, a group of young people decided to create a cross more than 2 meters tall, made only from scraps of wood collected from the streets and rubble. They placed it in the middle of a plaza and began praying around it every night. They didn't ask for permission. They didn't wait for approval. They simply obeyed what they felt in their hearts. And at the base of the cross they wrote, in white letters, "Here begins the new era." What no one expected was that this image, shared on social media, would reach the eyes of missionaries in distant countries who began sending messages of confirmation. We are seeing the same thing in our dreams. Mexico has been called. Heaven was weaving an invisible web between willing hearts, and what had previously seemed like just an emotional wave now took the form of a structured, clear, and irrevocable call. But there was one condition. A consecrated woman in Oaxaca shared that, during a holy hour, she felt this warning within her. Mexico has been chosen, but it can reject its election. And if it does, the darkness will be 7 times greater. It was as if heaven had placed before the nation a prophetic fork in the road. Embrace the mission and ignite the new era, or reject it and enter a darker night than ever. free will remained intact. The choice was not only the virgins, it was also the people's. It was then that leaders from different dioceses, Christian communities, independent missionaries, lay people and priests began to organize what they called the prophetic consecration of Mexico. It wasn't a massive event. They weren't looking for packed stadiums. It was a chain of committed hearts, on their knees, praying from their homes, their chapels, their streets, to say one thing to Mary: yes, we want, we accept. That consecration, although invisible to the news, moved mountains in the spiritual world. In the following week, several testimonies spoke of deliverances, miracles of healing, and family reconciliations. It was as if heaven had released a gentle rain upon a dry land, and now flowers were beginning to bloom. But the deepest part was yet to come. In the early morning of June 25th, a symbolic date for several Marian apparitions around the world, witnesses in at least 7 different cities in Mexico claimed to have seen a white light above churches dedicated to Mary. It lasted no more than 30 seconds. It wasn't captured on camera. But those who saw it felt the same. A presence, a certainty, a voice in their souls saying, "There's no turning back. The new has begun. And if it has really begun, then now it's all up to you." He says with faith, "I accept the call. Mexico will be light." And if you felt this word confronted you, share this video with 3 people who are also searching for their purpose during this time. Subscribe to the channel, leave your like, and keep your heart alert, because in the next video we'll reveal the day Mary will speak again, a date that could shake the spiritual history of the continent. There is no date on the liturgical calendar, no ecclesial event, no diplomatic summit that has stirred as much silent anticipation as this. The day when Mary will speak again, but not as she has in past apparitions. This time, heaven has hinted that it will not be a message for just one person, nor reserved for hidden visionaries. It will be a collective tremor, a word that will pierce the souls of the humble and overthrow the pride of the great. A voice that will resonate in those who pray, but also in those who have forgotten how to pray. The date has not been officially declared, but attentive hearts already sense it. The signs are converging. Time is drawing closer. Echoes of the past resound like bells, announcing the birth of something that cannot be contained. For months, the faithful have reported dreams with a common pattern. Dark skies that suddenly open with an intense light, followed by a phrase spoken in a maternal voice. "I have waited for this moment. Today I speak for all my children." In San Juan de los Lagos, a young woman named Karina recounted that while worshipping in silence, she felt a warm breeze on her face, as if someone were breathing on her. Then she heard a date with inner clarity, June 25th. She didn't know why, but from that day on, her prayer changed. She began to pray for the whole world, to pray for those who no longer believe, to intercede for priests, governments, single mothers, and confused young people. The same thing happened to a priest in Chihuahua. During a simple mass, he felt he had to stop the homily. With his eyes closed, he said, "Mary will speak again. She won't do it to accuse. She will do it to awaken. And when she does, no one will be able to say they weren't warned." The entire parish fell silent. Some wept. Others left the church with their hearts in their throats, knowing they had just heard something that wasn't human. The messages began to multiply, but they all pointed to the same thing. The time of warning is approaching, not as a tragedy, but as a correction. A pause, a moment in which humanity will be able to see itself as it truly is, without masks, without excuses. And from that mirror, each soul will decide its destiny. In this context, the Mexican faithful began to prepare their hearts. They didn't expect a spectacle. They didn't expect fire or earthquakes. They expected silence. Because they knew that when heaven speaks, it often does so quietly, but with a force that shakes the foundations of the soul. At the Basilica of Guadalupe, in recent days, nightly vigils have multiplied. not organized by bishops, but by lay people, families, young people, mothers on their knees. People arrive in silence, kneel and wait. No one knows exactly what they are waiting for, but everyone feels they are about to witness something greater than themselves. And the promise contained in the previous messages cannot remain unfulfilled. The Virgin has said, "I will not leave you alone. I will speak again, and my word will not be ignored this time." Those words did not fall on empty ground. They lit lamps. They awakened consciences. And now the people are watching, as those who know that the beloved is about to arrive. But what exactly will happen? No one knows for sure. Some think it will be a new message that will move everyone. Others believe it will manifest itself in visible miracles. And the most humble claim, it will simply be an inner voice that will resonate in each of us at the same moment, as if a heavenly bell were ringing in unison in the hearts of millions. The truth is that the world has entered a period that no longer allows for neutrality. Either the light is turned on or the darkness is embraced. And Mexico, as has been repeated time and again, has been chosen to be a beacon. But a beacon only fulfills its purpose if it's lit. If not, it's just an empty tower. Therefore, the day Mary speaks again will not only be to console, it will be to command, to gather, to separate, to usher in a new prophetic time in which Christians will be called to be true salt, not spectators, in which families will have to decide whether they serve heaven or the world, in which the nations will know that the kingdom of God is not a theory, but a living reality already underway. That day won't be a spectacle, it will be a choice. One last chance for the lukewarm to make up their minds, for the strong to stand firm, for the wounded to be healed, and for the children who strayed away to return home before the door closes. And if that day is coming, as many believe, then now is the time to prepare, not with fear, but with love, not with anxiety, but with faith, not with indifference, but with prayer. And you who have come this far are not by chance. It's because you were called, because there is a mission for you, because when Mary speaks, your heart must be awake to listen. Say with faith, "When Mary speaks, I will be on my knees." Share this message with 3 people you know who can't fall asleep. Leave your like if you feel this calling is also for you, and subscribe to the channel, because this is not the end. It's just the beginning of what heaven has begun to do with Mexico and with all the hearts that allow themselves to be touched.